Welcome to Will This Be in the Test, the podcast that delves into the ever-evolving landscape of education, training, qualifications and assessment. In today's episode, we'll explore the push to modernise assessment and question whether using technology just for the sake of it is the right path. We'll ask, can tech truly make assessments fairer and more effective? In our news roundup, we'll discuss the House of Lords inquiry into the UK's apprenticeships and in-work training systems. It's focused on future skills needs and how to improve the current policies to better serve individuals and businesses. We're also excited to share a conversation with Ian Castledine, Head of Proposition at RM, where we dive into how technology can support a more holistic approach to assessment. Plus, we'll answer listener questions in our Hands Up segment. And as always, it wouldn't be an education podcast without a little homework to keep you sharp. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get started. Okay, so we're into the news section, and today I have Darren Howells, who is CEO of Agored Cymru. Good morning, Darren.
Morning, Oshan. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Today's news review focuses on a call for evidence reopened by the Lords Committee, chaired by Baroness Taylor of Bolton, on the future of UK skills and training policy. And the focus on this is on apprenticeships and training in the context of what the UK economy will need moving forward. Wow, I mean, that's quite vague. They're looking at policies following new government policies, apprenticeships, in-work training, employer roles, government involvement, and the evidence would have been coming in now at the end of September, beginning of October. Do you think, Darren, that the current system is equipping people with the right skills for the future, or do you think it might need reform?
I think here we go again with another reform. I think the change of government has kick-started another reason for looking at the skills agenda generally. It's always difficult to see if we are equipping our people to have the right skills to do jobs which are required both now and in the future. So I think the system, you could argue, is right. I think the way it's implemented, falls down in certain areas. And I think the fact that it's a UK skills policy is very difficult to implement because of the devolved nations and the different focuses on skills and how skills are delivered in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So I think it's interesting that to see how the influence of the Westminster government filters into the other nations. But I think the system works, but I think it even further has to be employer-driven rather than government-driven.
That's interesting. Maybe we should look at the government in a second, but let's look at the skills themselves. What kind of skills do you think the UK economy will need in the future?
Well, I think the emerging sectors are what everybody is tended to look at. So your digital skills, your green skills, and I think that's absolutely required. But I think we shouldn't ignore the traditional skills that are also needed for the future. I know Wales, for example, is looking at essential skills like health and social care, food production, utilities, and agriculture to meet their needs, which may not exactly meet the needs of the wider UK. Whilst there are pockets within the country where digital skills and green energy is a massive factor. So again, it's very difficult to look at it from a UK perspective when there are so many different needs within each country and within each region. So you can look at the agricultural areas, you can look at the industrial areas where skills are absolutely needed, but they do differ. So that's where it's very difficult to implement a single strategy on the whole nation.
I suppose those sectors are developing so quickly as well at the moment that the skills that candidates and learners will be learning will potentially not be relevant by the time they come to use them in the workplace, or they will have needed to have adapted. Let's look at, for example, engineering. We have learners who will have learned mechanics and engineering, but the new technologies that are coming through are hydrogen-based and electric cars. That skill set will have completely need to have changed as well.
Absolutely. And, we are developing qualifications now for job roles that didn't exist even 12 months ago. So we have to horizon scan to make sure that the skills demands of the future are met when they're needed rather than closer to the time. So if we're looking 2 years ahead, we need to ensure that the qualifications and the system can meet the needs of that time rather than waiting until that time arrives and we start to develop from there. So I think it's making sure that what is relevant today is relevant for today's workers.
A point you just made about the employers needing to drive it is really important here, because, of course, that is where that flexibility is going to come into the system, isn't it? Because if the demand is there from the employers that they need these skills, that is what will keep those skills relevant. Is there a role for government here then? What can the governments do? Like you said, there's devolved matters, but let's just focus on England just for a second in terms of they're the ones looking at this report. What can they do? What can they get out of this report?
I think skills has to be supported and funded at appropriate levels. I think there are differentials across the nations as well. I think there has to be a level playing field. So there has to be parity between workers or students across all the nations. And I think the government should, ensure that there is that parity. There has to be consistency between employers because, again, employers work across the four nations. Our big national employers, I'm sure scratch their heads as to how can they offer the appropriate level of skills training to their workers who may be based in Scotland, Wales, England, or Northern Ireland. So again, the government really has to look at it from a financial perspective to make sure things are funded appropriately. Because if they're not funded appropriately, the demand will dip and we will be left with skills gaps, or bigger skills gaps than we've currently got.
Because the UK Commission for Employment and Skills did say in a recent report that Scotland and Wales have been quicker to adapt their frameworks, responding to this future skills need. And obviously climate change and digitalisation are the two big issues. And they do feed into a lot of the other skills as well, don't they? In healthcare, there's going to be a lot of digital. In agriculture, there's going to be a lot of green skills involved. If we have a focus on co-designing training with employers and governments, what could we as awarding bodies do to get involved in that kind of process? Who are we speaking to at the moment in order to develop these kinds of apprenticeship frameworks?
It has to be driven by need and driven by employer need. I think the employers are at the sharp end. They know what skills are needed. They know where the gaps are and they know what needs to be done to fill those gaps. I think they need to have a greater share of voice. We as an awarding body are just part of that process. So we create the opportunities for learners to get the knowledge and skills to further their careers. So we are part of a very, very long process. Certainly if you look at apprenticeships are a product which the awarding bodies create and our delivery partners deliver. And by ensuring that what we develop is ready, fit for purpose, and is done quickly and is ready for the market, then we can ensure that the learners are getting the appropriate training when they need it, rather than being taught traditional methods in a modern society. And I think that's the difficulty. And you're absolutely right. Digitization and green skills come into everybody's job role. Whether you're a bricklayer or whether you're a physicist, it doesn't really matter what your role is. There is a modern element to these roles. And I think we should also recognise the part of retraining and lifelong learning in all this. And I think we don't have jobs for life anymore. And through redundancies and through changes, that we've got a lot of very experienced workers out there who are looking to retrain, and we should encompass their knowledge and their skills to ensure that they can fulfil opportunities and different career objectives.
That's a really interesting point. I think coming back into the workforce, reskilling, retraining as obviously new skills are required. Do you think, therefore, finally, from an ideological perspective, that more needs to be done and perhaps the government's role should be in destigmatizing this reskilling and destigmatizing the focus on skills as opposed to academic qualifications and academic progression?
It has to be skills-led. The academic side and the theoretical side is very, very important. But we need to really focus on the doing rather than the talking. So I think you're absolutely right. With more experienced learners within the education sector, we should really look at how can we utilise what they can bring to the education sector. And it's not about teaching for the sake of teaching. It's about giving them skills to go and do jobs which they may have thought they would never even consider, or it may be something that they may have thought of they would like to do, but were never in the position to do. And I think we need to support everybody appropriately. But in order to do that, we have to have the appropriate funding and the appropriate foresight in order to do that. And a part of that is the parity across nations. It is the currency and the brand of apprenticeships to make sure that they mean the same thing to everyone. And I think we have a job to do to ensure that, apprenticeships as a brand is recognised and is demanded and understood by employers, learners, and parents as well.
Yeah, and learners of all ages, because we hear so much about learners over the age of 50 struggling to get back into the workforce because they are too experienced or they are too expensive.
And we do see this, particularly with the Cymru 2030 focus with Welsh Government, where lifelong learning is at the heart of everything we do. So, we have to ensure that people have the opportunity to retrain wherever they are within their careers. And if they want to take a completely different route, they should be supported and encouraged to do so. So I think there are examples out there of good practice, and I think it's something which we should really focus on to ensure there is that parity, as I say, across nations, with the Westminster government overseeing the skills agenda, but it being maybe implemented in slightly different ways depending on where you live.
Thanks very much, Darren. That was really, really interesting.
Thanks, Oshan. Pleasure.
So this week's guest is Ian Castledine, and he is Head of Propositions at RM, the show.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me along today. Yeah, some of your listeners might have heard of RM in the past. Certainly my first interaction with RM was when I was at school, and I was sat using a computer with the RM logo on it. And so I ended up running a school network back in about 1992, 93, which looked great on the CV when I applied to work at RM back in the late 90s. RM been around 50 years, working exclusively on educational technology. We've changed a lot in that time, you'd be unsurprised to know. So whereas we used to really focus mostly back in the day on building computers, running school networks, and we still do a lot of that even now. But over the last few years, we've then shifted to also provide a lot of educational supplies. And your listeners might have come across things like B-bots, which are used for teaching control systems, for example, particularly in primary schools. And then the part of the group that I work in is really focused around assessment and around providing systems and services that support organisations in using digital technologies and adopting digital assessment. So it's a very, very varied and a really interesting business to be part of.
Yeah, I remember talking about school. My mum was a primary school teacher. There was a shift, I think, from Acorn-style computers to RM, and I remember her having a classroom with RM machines in there. So that takes me back as well to my youth, my first interactions with RM. So what have been the key factors in the change? Because RM has obviously said 50 years. They've obviously had to change quite a bit during that time. Have there been any big milestones that have made the company make these decisions and decide on these different routes?
Yeah, I mean, we've had to adapt to reflect changes in the dynamics in the industry. As I said, we used to provide and manufacture PCs. In fact, the way that was really where RM first originated was the founders were involved in actually creating the circuitry, which was used to build IBM compatible PCs. And about probably 10 years or so ago now, we stopped manufacturing PCs because, to be frank, to compete with some of the big global multinational players really isn't a thing to do profitably out of a factory based in Oxfordshire. So technology changes have played the part, but also government changes. So we've seen significant changes over years with things like the Building Schools for Future programme that I was heavily involved with, that was having a massive impact in terms of how technology was supporting students in some of these newer forward-thinking school designs that were being put together. But then over the last few years, that has changed as well. We're now looking at how we can support a very different industry and a very lots of emerging things, such as how do you use the power of artificial intelligence in the classroom. So we've had to continue to adapt in that landscape. It makes really interesting roles, you can imagine.
I suppose the fact that you've been going for so long, you already have that kind of longevity in terms of a business. It means that adapting has been something that you've done quite naturally.
Yeah, that's right. And we're working in an industry that's constantly changing, so we've had to adapt. But even as we look at some of the newer things like the use of AI, for example, things are changing so rapidly. And the understanding is changing so rapidly as well that that's having to it's having a massive impact on how we approach products and services, and more about how our clients are able to to take some of those things that we're providing and actually get good value out of them in the classroom and in the colleges and professional organisations that we work with as well. So yeah, it's a constantly changing themes.
I'm assuming that you provide for a large scope of learners, of schools, and what kind of approach does RM take to empower all these different types of learners?
We work with a number of different providers and with users at different stages of their educational journey as well. The common thread through that is trying to empower organisations to assess in ways that are really authentic and really well aligned with the skills that they're trying to promote for the individuals that they work with. For example, if we're working with an accountancy professional qualification organisation, a big part of my role is trying to find ways in which we can make that assessment designs really well aligned with the skills that they're trying to promote for the accountants who are going to be going out to work in the workplace. So having things that are really well connected to the expectations of their industries and their employers. So that has seen over the last few years a massive shift. If you go back 10 years when I first started working in the assessment industry, accountants were assessed on pen and paper. And to be frank, that was the first, well, it was certainly the last time that an accountant would then use balance sheet paper, the squared paper that accountants use to create balance sheets and P&Ls. Because, as they moved into the workplace, it was an IT-enabled landscape. Yeah. So a big shift for us has been seeing the way that those subjects are assessed move to being much closer aligned to the actual skills that are being used by accountants. So we've then seen the adoption of on-screen reproductions of a spreadsheet through to actual spreadsheet technology embedded in the item types. And we're increasingly now seeing that move on to look at the broader range of skills that an accountant's expected to have in the workplace, maybe presenting accounts or doing presentations, meeting with clients and thinking about a much, much richer and broader view of what makes a good quality accountant. And the same would apply in other industries as well.
This is quite a big theme at the moment, isn't it? A move from knowledge-based assessment to skills-based. So we're actually looking at what a candidate or what a learner can actually do that will be required. I like the idea that an accountant will actually train on a spreadsheet as opposed to on a piece of paper. What other sort of industries are using this kind of embedded skills assessment?
I'm seeing this through so many different industries and going right back to general qualifications as well, actually. We're doing an increasing amount of work around even things like computer science qualifications in GCSE level skills, where at the moment, too many of that type of skills, again, are assessed on pen and paper. And that is shifting now to having embedded tooling, as a core part of the assessment design. I'm seeing much better use of imaging technology and using things like VR to bring to life the actual experiences that an individual is expected to use and the realities of their workplace to make the assessments much, much more realistic. I guess you're seeing a lot of that as well, and in the sorts of qualifications that that you guys are looking at and seeing.
Yeah, it's really fun at the moment because we're in a position where working with the regulator, working with companies such as yourselves and speaking to people across the industry, there really is a thirst for wanting to create these very rich environments where learners can be tested in an environment where those skills will be required in the future. What I like about what you're saying, though, is that the personalization is not just in terms of what the learner needs, but it's also what the person assessing needs. So the entire spectrum, we're seeing both ends come together into a nice sweet spot where a learner is able to show how they can work in a certain way and choose the best format for which they can demonstrate, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit again in a second. But also the people that are doing the assessments are able to tweak that assessment in order to be able to really drill down into the type of skills that they need that learner to show.
I think that's absolutely right. I was, maybe speak personally for a minute. I've just set out on a level 7 apprenticeship that has been sponsored through my employer. And part of that is, I'm sat now as a candidate at the other side of things, not just looking at the systems that are used to set exams, but now at systems that are used to manage learning and assessment as part of the broader learning process. And it's really interesting to look at it through that different lens. One of the things that I've taken away so far is that in submitting assignments for marking, I'm starting to really value the idea of automated marking in that, because the things that I'm putting together, I'm still feeling my way with. I don't necessarily feel that I want to submit work yet to be reviewed by somebody who knows what they're talking about. I just like to get some instant feedback to see how things are going. And so for me, I'm really valuing the use of, or the opportunity of, things like AI to be able to give me feedback. When I was talking to some of my colleagues who are looking at the same programme, they're really not taken by that as a concept and would love to have much richer, completely human-centred feedback from the start. So it's just showing that very different people have got different approaches to learning and to assessment. And one of the things that I think we're going to see much more of in the coming times is that sense of personalisation, and having approaches to learning and approaches to assessment that are much better aligned to individuals' needs and preferences. I think it's really, really exciting.
Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of, there's been research done as well, isn't it, in terms of how long the feedback takes to reach the learner and the efficacy of that feedback. And if that feedback doesn't get to them quick enough, they won't be able to build on it. And so there is a school of thought that says the quicker you can get that feedback, so if you can automate it, the better it is for that learner. But we also know that using some sort of numerical rubric or being able to score something isn't always the best way to mark work, which is always a question that's asked of these digital typed assessments, where, let's be honest, traditionally it started off as MCQs, I've now learned the acronym, multiple choice questions, and you guys have built a platform which allows a lot more intensive, a lot more creative ways of assessing digitally. However, we are sometimes looking for a more holistic approach, aren't we? And I'm sure with your assignments, when you're writing large essays and things like that, that can't be necessarily marked automatically. So what can we do? What sort of systems could we look at in order to get that more human, holistic touch, even though we are looking to modernise and digitise assessments?
No, it's a really good question. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind around that. I mean, one is that the breadth of different styles of assessment is amazing and is growing. So we've been looking recently into introducing some newer item types into our system to support things like flow charts and logic flows and things like that will give a much richer experience to the individual student. And there's some of those things can be auto-marked, but in most cases, they're the sorts of content that really need that human marking element, whether that's against a straight conventional mark scheme or whether it's looking at the particular skills that are being assessed, and then how effectively an individual student is meeting those skills. Now, as we look around the world at different age groups of learners, it's general quals as well as in the professional qualification space, we're working with a number of providers that have got, really very, very different ways of assessing skills. I look at the New Zealand system, for example, in the general qualification system, which is often held up as a bit of a benchmark of a new way of approaching things. And the NCEA in New Zealand is really built around a whole standards-based system that looks at whether you as an individual have met the particular standard or whether you've exceeded it or excelled in it. And it's really interesting then as to how you actually go about assessing that. And that's one of the things that we've spent a lot of time and energy actually building systems that can support the quality models that are still needed when you're marking in a much richer way than just against a simple conventional mark scheme. So that's really interesting. And then the other one would be around where there are subjects or areas that simply don't lend themselves to that really well-defined marking structure. And one of the things that we've done a lot of work on in recent years is around comparative judgment, which I don't know if have you come across the comparative judgment model at all?
I have, in terms of, back in my teaching days, it was the way of not marking, if you see what I mean. It was giving feedback and assessing work without, and I use inverted commas for listeners here, without marking, which was very popular for teachers in terms of cognitive load, so they wouldn't have to do a lot of marking work. But it was also beneficial for the students because it was focused on general feeling of their work. Were they meeting the requirements? Was the task or the thing that they had performed meeting what it was meant to, as opposed to drilling down and 2 ticks and a wishing the life out of every piece of work they were doing. And I don't know if have I hit the right kind of area there, Ian? You can
absolutely on the money, I think. So we've got something within our portfolio, RM Compare, and basically you will get a holistic statement put on the screen. It might be something about the complexity or a particular part of the curriculum or whatever it is really. And then the system will give you 2 bits of work and get you to simply say which is better compared to that against that holistic statement. And then it will go away and give you 2 more pieces of work and ask you which is better. And depending on the assessment, you might as a judge be asked to give a reason as to why you've picked one over the other. You might be asked to provide a little bit more of a justification, or it might simply be, which is better. And then the art of adaptive comparative judgment means that it will hone the bits of work that it's giving to you to make it more efficient. And by doing that repeatedly through a judging session, you end up with a rank order. And broadly speaking, you'll have a piece of work that best fits the holistic statement at one end and one that least well addresses it at the other. And there's a whole pile of data that you've then got that you can then do stuff with. I was part of a workshop a few months ago where we got a set of art teachers together, and the piece of work that they were assessing was a ceramic tile. I don't know if you remember when you were at school, you might have been given a 6-inch square tile and a load of clay, and you had to create stuff with it, whether different textures or lines or trying to represent a particular object or whatever it was. And in a way, that was a brilliant example of where using comparative judgment worked far, far better than just being assessed against a conventional mark scheme. And we had about 15 art teachers in the room. And there were 20 or 30 individual of these ceramic tiles that had photos taken of them. And then the system was simply presenting to the art teachers a series of pictures of these ceramic tiles. And myself and one of my colleagues were part of that as well. So it was great because it meant that as non-art specialists, because I'll be brutally honest, art is not my skill at all. It never has been. But to put a couple of non-art specialists alongside art teachers, that we were able to take part in the judging as well. What was even more interesting was that at the end of the judging session, all of the data that's collected allows you to see information not just about the pieces of work, but also about the nature of the people who were judging. We could see that there was really, really good alignment with the people in that room, that everybody broadly was in agreement about how these different bits of art measured up to the required statement, the required standard. There were just 2 outliers, me and my colleague. So as a simple way of showing that actually you've even got a measure of marking standards and marking quality in here, It was a great example. And I can see that there's so many different applications for that sort of technology, for things that are emerging as skills and capabilities that just don't lend themselves to normal marking. So it's really, really exciting.
I suppose it's important then, you've obviously identified the importance of the expertise in terms of making the judgment, but having the right number of people judging as well, the breadth of experience filtering into that algorithm. It's basically you're making a holistic bubble sort.
You are, holistic bubble sort. I think that's a really, really good description. Yeah. And one of the things that we were looking at in that particular trial was we'd got representatives from a number of different schools, and we were looking at how you could make comparisons for the same assessment but being conducted across, with work being provided and with work being created by students from different schools. Yeah. So it was a way of having a measure of standardization and moderation in that context as well, which would have been quite hard to do with a conventional mark scheme of just looking at pieces of work in isolation in each establishment. And again, as we look at more vocational skills that are being taught and administered in different centres and different contexts, I think something like that's a really interesting way of finding, just approaching assessment quite differently, rather than just creating a fairly conventional assessment and deploying it out to all of the different centres.
And it removes a lot of these things that I've always been quite, not skeptical, that's a bit too strong a word, but I've always wondered of the fairness of things like the bell curve and tolerance, marking tolerance. Where does that line fall? Is that too far out of tolerance? No, we need to reassess that. I've always felt that can be a bit unfair on learners who've had their work marked by perhaps one set of assessors compared to other learners who've had their work marked by another set of assessors. This seems like a lot more of a collaborative approach, which would give you a much fairer distribution of the marks or the ranking of the work at the end. And it seems as well that it could be applied to obviously so many different subjects. I'm thinking of essays. How do you mark an essay in terms of how good it is and give it a numerical value? This answers that question, doesn't it?
No, it really does. Even things like somebody, going back to my accountant's example earlier on, how do you assess somebody giving a PowerPoint presentation or conducting a meeting with a client? Actually, sometimes it'd be just assessing that against a conventional mark scheme is going to be quite limited in actually getting rich feedback to a student. Whereas if you were to able to say, look, which is better? If you were to just watch a 2-minute video of a piece of work and compare it with a 2-minute video from somebody else, well, it might be that somebody prefers to present using PowerPoint, somebody else prefers to stand up without slides and just deliver a speech. Lots of different ways that against a conventional mark scheme, really hard. But when you're simply comparing two things, you can actually get a really good view of that. So there are lots of cases where you can just think quite differently. But one of the things that I'm really keen on is how do you get that appropriate feedback to students? So, of course, historically in a summative high-stakes exam world, which has been where a lot of the assessment industry has been focused, actually the point about feedback, well, it's not really a thing. You do want to have a justification as to why a particular mark was awarded, but maybe that's simply so that you can check your markers' work and make sure they're marking to good quality, and you've got a way of justifying mark for the appeals process. Whereas now, as we're seeing assessment become so much more embedded through the learning process, getting that rich, insightful feedback that you can give back to students and let them act on it, gosh, that's invaluable. That's so powerful.
It's acknowledging the continuum of learning as opposed to saying, right, you've done that test, these are your marks, let's move on. It's what can you do next time to improve, or what changes could you make, or which is bringing evaluation and reflection. And reflection is the point where learning happens, is when you can look back and see how you could have perhaps made a different choice. And obviously you're removing as well the complexity that variables would add to an assessment. For example, in an interview, if you were meeting with a client, perhaps one client will act differently to another client.
Yeah, there's one other thing that might be worth even mentioning there, which is we've had some really interesting and positive feedback from where we've been using that type of technology, not to assess work for a student submitting a piece of coursework, whatever it is, for assessment by an expert, but also for peer-to-peer. Because as a student, we've done a piece of work with a university in the States where they were given the opportunity of taking part in a comparative judgment session before they submitted work. And the students that were able to do that and to look at, what a good one looks like and do some critiquing themselves of a piece of work and why it was better than another piece of work, it actually helped the learning process, not just for looking at their own work later, but just the act of looking at other pieces of work. And it was the project showed demonstrable improvements in learner outcomes for those students that took part in that exercise compared to those that didn't. So there's some really interesting things that come out through that whole landscape, actually.
This is more than modernising assessment. It's looking at a systematic reform of the way we look at learning, isn't it? And we can use technology not just to digitize or make things a bit more modern but we can actually use technology to improve the learning process.
I absolutely agree. A big part of my role within the business, and to be frank, the whole thing that drives RM as an organisation is about improving life chances of learners. And as soon as you ground this stuff in just looking at tech for tech's sake, you've lost the point. This is all about making sure that every learner is able to achieve to their best potential.
There's obviously been a big shift recently in terms of people. There's been less of a challenge, shall we say, from industry since the pandemic in terms of approaching and adopting digital technology. Do you think that we're still in a phase where people are adopting more technology, or are we starting to plateau back into a situation where people are less likely to accept these new digital advances?
It's a really good question. And I think there's been a maturing of approach to say, why do we want to adopt a particular piece of technology? A good example of that is around things like automated marking, which has been a hot topic for a number of years. Different organisations have made different progress in that. What we found was that a lot of our clients were talking about that, but not actually then seeing that through to fruition, because largely it was driven from almost seeing what other people are doing and wanting to be part of it, rather than actually understanding why they were trying to adopt AI. Whereas since since the pandemic, we've become much more aware of why we're doing a particular thing. So the thing that seems to be driving adoption right now is around student feedback, around finding new ways of empowering learners and trying to make a difference, rather than just looking at it for efficiency's sake, for example, even though there are clearly good benefits to be had there as well. But I think we're seeing that in a number of places. Also, schools that I work with, providers that I work with, are seeing that the pandemic exaggerated things that we were already seeing in the industry, from those that were empowered, engaged learners to those that weren't, and that gap really started to widen. So the use of newer technologies is a way of trying to close that gap and make sure that every learner is empowered and can achieve their best potential, really. So that's what we're seeing right now.
That's great, Ian. Thanks for your time today. If our listeners want to find out a bit more about you and about RM, what do they need to do and where do they need to go?
Yeah, quite simply, go to www.rm.com and you'll find out all about us, different bits for group. You'll hear about TTS. Some of your listeners might recognise that name. You'll read about assessment and also managed service part of the business as well. So yeah, rm.com is where to go.
That's fantastic. And hopefully you're going to come back and help us out with our other sections of the podcast a bit later on.
I'm looking forward to it.
now we're back for our Hands Up listener question segment of the podcast, and Ian Castledine has come back from RM to help us answer these questions. So welcome back, Ian.
Thank you.
So our listener question this week has come from someone who works in the public sector. The question is, my mind is always concerned about equity. How do you bring guardians on the journey so that they understand and can support the new ways that their children are being assessed? What could we do about those that can't afford or can't access internet connections?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, isn't it? And, it's one that, in all the time I've been working in the use of IT in education, that point about, we used to call it much more around digital divide, has become, has been a key part. We spoke earlier on about the impact of COVID. And, I think one of the things, I'm a school governor of a school in Stockport, and one of the things that we were really mindful of through the pandemic was that there were plenty of students who were engaging in online learning who had got their own laptop and had got internet connections at home, and so could fully engage in the delivery of a curriculum. But we were really mindful then that there were others who weren't like that. Maybe they didn't have any equipment at home. Maybe they were sharing devices between a number of siblings from the same family. Maybe they didn't have a place to sit and do the work or reliable internet access. And in a way, the onus is on all of us as providers, as educators, to be aware of the many, many different situations that our learners find themselves in. This isn't a way of saying that there's a magic solution here, but in the same way that we have to be really careful about not excluding individuals or making assumptions about what equipment that they have, I'd say that also there's the positive spin is that using technology can actually help to break down some of those barriers as well. So I think, for example, that historically, if an individual had been excluded from a conventional assessment process, for example, because they needed to have a particular, maybe they had somebody with them to do the writing, as an example, that individual was put off into a separate room and was excluded. Or an individual who was given a large print version of an exam booklet, as an example. Again, it was pointing out the differences. Whereas as we use more technology in different parts of the curriculum and the education process, there are ways that we have of breaking down some of those barriers as a native part of the application to try and be more inclusive of all learners.
But there's the other thing in terms of the equity, in terms of the technology. I suppose there's an onus on platforms like yourselves to make your as native as possible to any system, isn't it? So, for example, browser-based assessment, where it doesn't matter what type of device they have, it'll work.
Yeah, absolutely right. And one of the things that we'll do with organisations is look at what the right model is for their particular means of assessing. So, for example, some organisations will want to encourage individual learners to bring their own equipment, which is absolutely fine. And so using a native browser to take an assessment is fine. But then they might be really concerned about whether that is secure enough for their assessment. So we'll look at things like remote proctoring technologies, for example. We might have them using trusted devices in a training centre or in a college, but where they still want to have confidence that the student can't deviate from the assessment process itself. So we use Safe Exam Browser or something like that to put appropriate levels of restriction in place. So it's about being in tune with the particular nature of the assessment, of the organisation, of the stakes of the exam, and the ways that the individual learner is going to be interacting with that as well.
Yeah, and from the perspective of, say, an awarding body, or from the perspective of yourselves as providing a product, there's only so much we can do, and some of it, we have to be met by then government agencies who will step in and kind of meet us halfway. You can go above and beyond to make it inclusive and as personalizable and as empowering for those learners. But at the end of the day, there is a level of this equity that needs to be ensured from a central place.
Oh, absolutely. And as a provider, it's easier for us where there are some standard approaches that can be taken too. For example, making sure that particular screen readers work with the system, for example. But we recognise that the dynamic is that each individual can end up with their own particular preferences, their own devices, their own technologies, and we have to be really mindful of that. And that's not to say that every combination of every different thing can be tested, but equally we need to make sure that all candidates and all students have a really good experience. And that's a big part of the work that we do as a provider, is making sure that that landscape is good.
Looking back to when we were discussing about the pandemic earlier on, there are some excellent examples of local authorities, of local government, of national government who stepped in and provided for a lot of these candidates and learners who did not have internet access. And then there are examples also of where that didn't take place, but those are lessons that we have to learn as we move forward and as we adopt more digital and modernised assessment methods. Obviously, make sure that they are included.
I'm the eternal optimist, and I'll always look for the positives and things. And to be frank, it's quite difficult to do that when you look back at the pandemic. But I do think it's made us a lot more aware of some of those issues. And the challenge for all of us as accreditors, educators, for parents, is to become much more aware of those sorts of issues about how can we make the whole of the education and the learning landscape that much more inclusive than it has been.
And that's great. So we're welcoming Ian back for our final segment, the homework segment. As you know, it wouldn't be an education-based podcast if we didn't give you something to do at home before we have our next session. So Ian from RM, would you give us your homework for this week?
So I'm going to give your listeners 2 pieces of homework today.
Do you know, I remember teachers like you in school.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I hope they're useful and I hope they're interesting ones. So the first one, I mentioned comparative judgment earlier on in the episode, and I want to point you at Mark House's newsletter. So Mark's my product manager who works on RM Compare, and he's absolutely passionate about how it can drive improved learning outcomes. And he runs a blog at compare.rm.com. And there's a monthly newsletter that's published through there as well. It's a great read. This month looks back over 20 years, I think it is, since Alistair Porrett presented a paper about Let's Stop Marking Exams, which has sparked an awful lot of thought in that time as well. Pretty foundational in our thinking about comparative judgment and about how much value it can provide. So do stop by and have a look at Mark's blog. So compare.rm.com. That's first piece of homework. So that wasn't too painful for people, I don't think.
The link will be in the show notes, so make sure you take a look. And hit us up with the second one then, Ian.
I'll hit you with the second one. Well, the second one, I thought for a while about this as to what would be useful homework for people. And I want to get people reading and engaging more around the use of artificial intelligence. And there's been a huge amount of activity around, particularly around Gen AI over the last couple of years. And there's an awful lot of information and an awful lot of misinformation out there. And I don't want people to feel that they've got to be technical experts in AI, because to be frank, I don't think many of us feel like we're technical experts in AI, really. But I do want people to engage with the themes and the benefits and also the concerns about the use of AI as well, because it's being used extensively now in education, and some of its use you might not even be aware of, but I'm sure that those tutors and teachers are starting to use it really extensively to create learning content, assessment content, and so on. So whether that is generative, whether it's generating content or augmenting human capabilities by proctoring or marking exams, whatever it is. And I want people to engage with it. To be frank, a good place to start, maybe the AI in Education site, ai-in-education.co.uk. Nothing to do with RM, but looks to me like a really good place to start to engage with that subject if you haven't already done so. Loads of different resources there, different ideas that might help you to start engaging with some of those themes. But there's an awful lot to get your head around with AI, not least issues about bias, issues about protection of intellectual property, things like that. To me, what I'd love is to know that people are engaging in that whole area as a theme and thinking about how, not just how you can use it to improve the areas that you're working on as an individual, but also to be aware of some of the constraints and some of the things to be aware of in that space as well.
That's a really good point. And it's something that isn't brought up enough, I don't think, is that element of equity again, in terms of AI bias. And of course, AI is a sum of the information that it has been trained on. And of course, it depends where that information has come from and who has fed that information in as to where that bias may be. I think it is from a positive perspective, isn't it, Ian? Because we're all aware that AI is here to stay.
Absolutely, and in a way, that's what makes it important that we're properly and fully engaging in it. So, no, I mean, such an exciting area, and it's changing clearly, as we know. The whole way that we're living in society, not just the way that we're educating and assessing as well. But let's have a broad, rounded views about things. So hopefully that's good homework for your listeners.
Thank you very much. It's been absolutely fantastic having you on the show. As usual, I've enjoyed having a chat with you. We'll have to catch up again soon. Information on what we've spoken about will be in the show notes if people want to catch up on the homework. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much for being on the show.
Miles, thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. So thank you.
A big thank you to Ian Castledine and Darren for their valuable insights today. We also want to thank our listeners for sending in your questions. Please keep them coming. And if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, like and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. And if you've got a moment, please leave us a review. It really helps others discover the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.